more week. But that's a good practice right there. That was good. All right, so, and hang on just a minute. And I did try to do some work on the IT side, so hopefully this will work better than last week. But the plan is to finish up on Philippians 3, 13, and 14. Now, one of the reasons I'm doing this and prolonging it, one of the goals is to make sure that you memorize this. All right, so let's try it out. It's very simple to kind of unpack and then put back together. So the first thing we discovered, Paul's starting to write, and what's the word that goes in here? One. And so what's the significance of the one thing I do in terms of having a significant new year? What's the opposite of the one thing I do? The 40 things I dabble in. So the whole idea is for significance, there needs to be focus. That's what Paul opens up with. Then he goes on to say, forgetting the past. In other words, we learn from the past, but we don't want to be captive of the past. So he suggests that we forget the past. And then last week, we looked at another participle, straining. And we talked about the idea of straining in the spirit toward what is hit. So today we want to look at the next piece of the verse, pressing on toward the goal. And then next week we're going to finish up with the pleasure of the prize, which is to win the prize for which God has called me heavenward in Christ Jesus. So today we're going to talk about the power of the goal. Next week will be the pleasure of the prize. Everybody okay? All right. Now, who recognizes this bridge? Brooklyn Bridge. Now, what I wanted you to do is I want you to watch a brief clip on the building of the Brooklyn Bridge, and we want to look at the power of the goal in an individual's life. Are you ready, Chris?
What?
Yeah. We had a practice run. All right. Now, let's see. A second. All right, is everybody ready? Popcorn?
One of the most famous sights in New York is the Brooklyn Bridge. It's an amazing bridge with an equally amazing story of dedication and hard work. At the time of completion, it was the longest suspension bridge in the world and took 14 long years to complete. It was designed by John Roebling, who wanted a bridge that was beautiful and built to last. His plans made it 6 times stronger than it needed to be. But before construction of the bridge had even begun, John's foot was crushed, he developed tetanus, and he died. His 32-year-old son, Washington, became the chief engineer and shared his father's dream. But the bridge would not have been completed without his wife, Emily. Washington and many of the workers who worked deep below the surface developed decompression sickness. Washington kept working until he became so sick that he could not leave his bed. His wife, Emily, spent 11 years as his assistant, going between the workers and her husband's bedside. She learned higher mathematics and engineering and had a quick mind. She was soon well respected by all who worked on the bridge. The Roeblings had challenges of sickness, death, dishonest contractors, politicians, bedrock, fire, and all kinds of things going wrong, but they never gave up on their dream of a bridge connecting Brooklyn to Manhattan. When it was finally completed 14 years later, Emily Roebling was the first to cross the bridge. The Roeblings had blessed generations of New Yorkers with their dream and hard work. What would New York be like today without it?
All right, let's do a light. All right, let's look at some questions related to... Now, this wasn't in the film, but I'm going to ask you if you can discern this. Where do you think John Roebling, and of course this is right after the Civil War, so about 1859, where do you think he came up with the idea or dream to build the Brooklyn Bridge? And obviously at that time, Brooklyn was separated from Manhattan. So where do you think the idea came from? I'm sorry? What was the need, do you think? How did people before get from Brooklyn to Manhattan back and forth? Yeah. And they had a picture, it wasn't in this clip, but just picture all of these tall mast boats going back and forth as well as ferries, and that's your only mode of communicating and transporting from Manhattan to Brooklyn. And he and his son were on one of those ferries. And when the weather's bad and it's cold, it's horrible. So he starts thinking, shouldn't there be a better way? Now this is going to be an important part of our discussion today, because I believe God gives us goals, based part of which would be on needs. In other words, as you look around you and you see needs, I think what happens is that God starts to energize us with the possibility of a dream or a goal based upon meeting a need. Number 2. Let's see. Rebecca, read number 2.
How did Brooklyn's goal affect his life and the life of his family?
So he comes up with this dream or idea, and what happened? He died in the trying to go after it from tetanus. And then his son, we learn on the film, the way they built the towers was to have these things that they basically put down in the water, and he experienced the bends because they had to go as low as about 80 feet, I believe, on one side. The other side was about 40 feet. But he actually experienced the bends, he meaning the son, and basically was paralyzed. And then his wife steps in. She had to study mathematics, construction, engineering, and they worked out a system where he would communicate with her with taps on her arm because he couldn't speak. So she gets instructions, and then she goes out and tells the construction guys what to do. Would that disrupt your daily life a little bit? The point here is this dream or goal captivated and caused the whole family to be mobilized towards its accomplishment. So the question is, what caused Ropeling's family to continue working toward the goal despite difficulty? If you were the average family and the patriarch had an idea, starts out and dies, what do you think would happen in those families? Yes. Well, that was a nice shot, but it's not going anyplace. So what is it that caused the family to continue, you think, working on the dream of the patriarch? I'm sorry? Maybe an element of pride? Leadership. Maybe he had caused the family to buy in on this significant idea. Maybe he had helped in the sharing of the vision to create an environment where the family started to buy into it. Obviously, they had to own it. And the last question, were the Ropelings successful or significant? Interesting. And what is it that makes, if this were just built, a regular bridge, and you were successful building it, what is it in this case that made it also significant? Overcoming the obstacles? The commitment of the family. In other words, it was done in such a way that people watching realized that this was a significant mobilization behind an objective or goal for the whole family. And we also discovered that the difference between success and significance quite often is the impact on other people. And as you can see, he had to, Roebling initially had to come up with a way to create a suspension bridge. I mean, none of that engineering was in place. So just think of what he had to go through to arrive at the bridge itself. And then he had to put the different things down in the water, and all those things he had to come up with the first time. But the objective resulted in impacting positively people for a long time to come. So that's what we want to kind of hang on to today, is that goals can be significantly powerful in our lives. So let's look at kind of the power of a goal. 3 points, or 4. Read number 1 there, Ben Price.
Shaped circumstances versus being shaped by circumstances.
Now, if something is totally shaped by circumstances, to me that life looks like a sand dune. Have you been to the beach and you come back the following year and everything's changed? What happened? The tide and the elements moved everything around. And so the sand just kind of goes with the flow, right? Can you imagine a life that is totally shaped by circumstances? That means that this year, your life is pretty passive. And whatever happens, you're being shaped by it. Did you catch that idea? Versus being shaped by circumstances, that would be the Brooklyn Bridge, where you're figuring out a way to overcome the elements in order to shape what you desire to have happen. But notice the difference. Passivity, and sometimes when you have small children, that's called survival. Understand that? But if you stay in that mode, then your life is basically being shaped by things that are happening to you versus you shaping. Number two, a power of gold can turn a good intention into some real results. Have you thought as you start the new year that this might be a good time to get in better shape? To lose some weight? I call those good intentions. And they do well. You know, you sit around and say, oh, it'd be good for me to get in shape. But what is it that translates an intention into reality? It's when you translate the intention into a measurable goal. So you say, look, I want to lose X number of pounds. That's a goal then. I want to be working out 3 times, 4 times a week. That's a goal because I can measure it. There's a group we get with every New Year's, and we set goals, our predictions for the coming year. You know, every year they put down, one of the questions of the predictions is, will Cook in his golf game break 90? And what's happening now is it's really propelling me to make sure that I do break 90. And I figured out an easy way to do that. You know what it is?
9 holes.
You play a few holes, yes. But it's causing me now to take seriously lessons and other things. So anytime you can take an intention and put a measurable result on it, you find then things happen differently. Number 3, it helps you prioritize time and resources. If we're dabbling in 40 things and being shaped by circumstances, very little do we have in terms of discerning where to put money and time. Have you discovered this election year? And of course, we're all supporting Hunter. So, Hunter, this is not you. But I get so many requests for money, and it's kind of like, okay, I have to determine who I'm going to support and what I'm going to do. So the prioritization is really important with our resources of time and money. That happens when we have a goal. If we don't have a goal, then we're just responding to whatever's coming to us. And number 4, I think it's going to create opportunities for significance in our lives. And we talked about the goal being having a successful, significant life, not just a successful life or a surviving life, but to have significance associated with it. All right? Everybody sold on the power of a goal? All right, let's try to do something with it. I'm going to pivot just a little bit. If you had to answer this question, now, of course, in the Presbyterian Church, they put a lot of emphasis on our purpose in life is to glorify God forever, or to bring glory to God. It's kind of written in the catechism and so forth. Have you ever asked yourself the question, how do you glorify God when you're on earth? In other words, what kinds of things take place in your life that brings glory to God, do you think? So if you were to interview, let's say we went over to the church service and we asked different people sitting in the pew, what is it that you do that glorifies God? What kind of answers would you think we might get? Random answers. What? I'm sorry? Now, is that important? Yes, giving to the needy. Would we get other answers? Sharing the gospel, and is that important? Yes. We get other answers. Yes, certainly. Want to be more Christ-like. That brings glory to God. Now, I want you to see how Jesus answers this question in John chapter 17, verse 4. The context of that is, it's at the end of his earthly life. He's 33 years old, would fit right into our class. and he's praying a prayer to his heavenly Father. And this is what he says. Let's see. Bill, can you read that for us?
I have brought you glory on earth by finishing the work you gave me to do.
All right, so when Jesus is quizzed about what glorified the Father, what did he say? How did he respond?
Finishing the work.
Work sounds kind of pedestrian, doesn't it? Doesn't it sound like something that's non-spiritual? But in reality, Jesus is saying, when I was given some work to do and I did it, I brought glory to the Lord. So let's look at his life. When he was aged 0 to 12, how would you describe his work? What was he doing? Learn. He's growing up, right? Little kid. In the Jewish tradition, at age 13 to age 30, he was doing what? He was learning a trade. What was his trade? Carpenter. How long is that, by the way? 17 years. He's a carpenter, right? Just making stuff, developing muscles, working. At age 30 to 33, what was his work? He was called rabbi, right? He was an itinerant minister. He traveled from village to village. He healed people and he preached. At age 33, at the end of his life, his work was the death on the cross. Let me ask the question, which of those is more spiritual? Which of those qualify for accomplishing the work? All of them. Why? Right. When God gives us work to be done, it's the faithfulness to accomplish that work that brings glory, even though the work may not be spiritual work. Does that make sense? I mean, would he waste 17 years of his life doing non-spiritual things? Because what happens sometimes in our society is people that are the ministers, they're the spiritual people, and we're just guys out there slogging through the battle to make a living, raise a family, get our kids, so they don't kill each other. We get them out into college and going on, right? Not the case at all. And what I want to look at today is the integration of your life corresponding to the model that Jesus gave us. So let's look at this. Let's answer the question, what work have you and I been given to do? Okay, we're going to see the work falls in two categories. Universal work, that means it's been given to everybody, and unique work. That's going to be a unique set of things given to you in particular. All right? So let's look at universal and unique. First, universal. I call this the Great Construction. And Liza, can you read it from there?
Romans 8:28, "For those God before you also possess and to be conformed to the likeness of His Son, work out your salvation towards God at the work of commandment."
All right, I want everybody to picture, we talked about this before, that we are all wearing a sign called under construction. We haven't arrived. We don't arrive till we get to heaven. We're all under construction. Is that work? Yes. The idea of becoming more Christ-like is really work. It's God working in us and it's us working. But that's an important part of the work we've been called to do. So we call it the Great Construction. Let's look at the Great Commandment. Michael, can you read that?
Yes, love the Lord your God, love your neighbor as yourself.
Now, so there's an element in work of loving people. Have you discovered that? It's easy to love the likables, but when you got to love the unlikables, that's some work. Remember, Jesus said the way they will know we're followers of His is by the love we have for one another. That should be a unique aspect of Christian life. Unfortunately, it's just the opposite. We tend to have a hard time getting along with the unloving. And yet that's part of the universal work, loving. Let's look at the last piece, the Great Commission. Boyce, would you read that?
Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them and teaching them to obey all I command you.
All right, the only reason we're sitting here today is that the early disciples took this seriously. And when they started following Jesus, they took it upon themselves to invite other people to follow him also. It's called the Great Commission. Now, a lot of people say, well, I don't know that much. And what am I going to tell somebody? Well, the first disciples were following a guy by the name of John the Baptist. There were two guys, Andrew and Philip. They went to Jesus when they saw him. They pivoted from John the Baptist. They went to him. And they said, would you tell us about your ministry? And he said 3 words in John chapter 1. Come and see. So, they go hang out with Jesus for a day. Then it says, immediately, Andrew goes to his brother. Now, who's his brother? Peter. He goes up to Peter, and he says 3 words after he says, we found the Messiah. What does he say? Come and see. Did he know anything about Christianity? No. Did he comprehend all that was going on? No. He simply realized that in his sphere of influence that God had put him in, he had a brother. And the brother needed to know Jesus. So he simply goes and says, come and see. And then Philip goes to his friend Nathanael and says the same thing. 3 words. Come and see. Now, one of the challenges we have is that sometimes we feel like that Christianity is about getting all the Christians together, having a wonderful fellowship, a wonderful class, and aren't we really doing well? But the challenge here, as you can see, is that the Great Commission assumes that we have a sphere of influence, and our challenge is to go into that sphere of influence, and basically, maybe our theology is only 3 words. Not theology, but our understanding, and all we have to do is say, come and see, as opposed to thinking that we got to let the professional preachers do it, or we've got to know a whole lot about different things. Now, I keep sharing different stories from my experience, and sometimes maybe you've heard them more than once, but I don't have that many, so I'd have to recycle periodically. But Donna and I had been married about a year, moved back to Atlanta, and my sphere of influence in Atlanta was Georgia Tech and my fraternity. And so I kept thinking, I wonder if she's ready to go to a fraternity house party after a football game. And I said, I don't think she's ready yet. So we were at one of the games, and I determined that she's not ready for it yet. This is not, I can't introduce her to this early in our marriage. And I determined not to take her there. Well, as we're exiting the stadium, this guy comes up, fraternity brother, and he grabs me, puts a hold on my neck, and says, let's go to the house. So I couldn't, back away, so we start going up to the fraternity house. I walk in the door, and there's a fraternity brother there who had a blonde in one hand and a bottle in the other. And he was 3 sheets to the wind, and he said, hey, Cook, I haven't seen you in a while, what's going on? And I said, well, I'm with Campus Crusade for Christ. He said, what? He said, I thought you were social chairman. I said, I was. It's an interesting story. Would you like to hear it? And of course he mumbled, yeah, let's get together. Well, I couldn't tell him right then the story. So 3 weeks later, we go to Underground Atlanta for lunch. Now this guy was a stockbroker, a single guy, had all kind of money in the bank, had just returned for a gambling junket to Aruba. We sat down for lunch, and he said, tell me your story. Now here's what's the cool part. I didn't know it at the time, but God had been working in his life. And one of the ways he works in affluent people's lives is he gives them everything. And guess what happens when you get everything? You're empty. Because see, you're always thinking, if I can get the next thing, then I'm really going to feel great, and boy, we'll be swinging. But when you get those things, you realize there's something missing. And I shared with him what had happened to me, how I'd come to faith in Christ. And I said, is this something you'd like to consider? He said, well, how does it work? So I took him through a little booklet. And right there, he bowed his eyes. I said, when do you think would be the best time to pray and invite Christ to your life? He said, well, why not right now? And this broker, stockbroker, became my first follower that I was able to introduce to Christ here in Atlanta. And what happened then is we started talking to other fraternity guys. Now, the reason I'm sharing this is sometimes we get the idea that we have to go out and knock on doors, that we have to go out and wrestle people to the ground, you know. But I believe there's a sphere of influence where you have natural relationships. And if you don't know all the sharing of the gospel, it doesn't matter. All you have to do is say 3 words now. What are they? Come and see. You invite them to the class. You invite them to something, but come and see. Now, we've got the Great Construction. That means we're walking around with a sign that says under construction. And of course, your husband or wife says, yes, that is really true. They're under construction. Also, we're admonished to love. So it's got the Great Commandment, and we've got the Great Commission. Where do you pull this stuff off? The construction, the commandment, and the commission. You pull it off in your unique work that God's called you to do. And let's just look at some of these unique things. Let's see, let me get a volunteer. Okay. So, now Paul's writing this letter to the Philippians. So, if he were stopped by the Roman authorities and administered a questionnaire and it had vocation, what would he put down? Tent maker. He refused to have a full-time professional designation as preacher. Why? Why do you think? It doesn't tell us, by the way, but just what would you surmise? Have you found sometimes when people say they're preachers or full-time Christian work, how people kind of step back? It's like you got a cold or I don't want that. The coolest thing in the world is when you're just a business person, a businesswoman, a homemaker, a business guy, and you've got this contagion called a relationship with Christ, and therefore there's no barriers. So the thing about Paul and Barnabas is they viewed their calling as tent making as well as establishing these churches all over the Roman Empire. And then what he says in 1 Corinthians 7, if God has assigned you a particular area, what should you do initially? Stay there. Remember the story of the demoniac who is so bad they have to chain him? You know, and he doesn't wear clothes and he hangs out in a graveyard. And Jesus comes over. This is on the east side of the Sea of Galilee. And he heals this guy. And he put clothes on him. And he goes to Jesus and says, okay, now I'm ready to join your guys and we'll travel around. And if you're thinking, you know, evangelistic campaigns, you can imagine the hype you could have with a former demoniac who could go on the stage and talk about his life. What does Jesus say to him? He says, I want you to stay here. I want you to stay in your sphere of influence where you're assigned, because that's where I want you to have a ministry and a work. So sometimes as Christians we get all hyped up about I've got to go someplace and do something. And Paul's basically saying everybody's got a unique calling. Now, does the unique calling change over time? Yes. It's called children. It's called life stages. But the point is, right now, God has everybody in this room in a unique calling of some type. Is that a spiritual calling, if you make sense? I think most professions qualify except attorneys.
Somebody's got to keep everybody else in line.
That's right. And of course, our guest attorney, I'm not talking to you, I'm talking to you. All right, so we have unique work in our calling, which means we got to work hard and we got to provide resources for the family, and that's a sense of calling and mission. Let's look at number 2. Needs. Shannon, read that one.
Philippians 4:19. Oh, I'm sorry, Shane.
No. Go.
Sorry.
No.
Do I read it together?
What a communications team.
My God will meet all your needs according to his riches and glory.
All right, now here's the point. If there is a need in your life, you have to view that as some work that God has given you to do. Again, I'm looking for you to think about life as an integrated life, not a spiritual and secular. If you have a need, over the last several years, Don and I, as you know, it's hard to believe, but we are actually getting a little bit older. And so having this kind of retirement fund set up is important. So we go into every year and we are focusing on a need that we have, and that is to reach a certain level. And it orients and reorients our plans for the entire year. It's going to be true in your lives as you go through different stages. You'll have certain needs that will become priorities at different times. Number 3, opportunities. Read that one, somebody.
Revelations 3:8. I have placed before you an open door.
Now what happens in life is God opens a door. It's kind of amazing how these things happen. You'll be going along the way and all of a sudden this door will open. Now, as we discussed last year, that doesn't always mean God's leading this way, but when you have an open door, the scriptures are implying that you should at least look in. This could be an opportunity that could start to develop. We shared the story how 2 years ago we were getting ready to leave the church after visiting one summer and ran into Vic Pence standing out in his robe. Was it July or June or August? It was very hot, which is unusual to see a big church pastor standing outside in his robe, sweating, greeting people. So Don and I are ready to walk across the street and get in the car, and was it you or me? It's always Don. See, if you marry well, then you can always make sure that they take care of you. She says, why don't we go just introduce ourselves to Vic? So we go back across the street, and he, as you know, he's so gracious, he just stayed there as long as anybody was there, didn't try to run away. We go introduce ourselves, found out that he had come to the Lord through a friend of ours in California in the 60s. We had some common ground. We started talking, and he said, have you ever thought about coming over and helping us put together a class for young couples? He provided an opportunity. So last year, we stepped through that. But my point is, we were minding our own business, getting ready to go to lunch. And that's how God does it sometimes. You're just going along, and here comes this opportunity. And the last area is this. Psalm 37:4. Someone read that. The other Shannon. Shannon with an O.
Delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart.
This is an important verse. It basically says that one of the ways God gets to your thinking is you focus on Him. And as you focus on the Lord in a daily walk, He starts to implant in your life certain desires. And these desires then become candidates for goals. Somebody says, well, you know, I've always wanted to do this and this and this, but it can't be God's will. Why? Well, I really like to do it so much. Well, sometimes we have the idea that anything we really like to do, God's looking over the banisters of heaven saying, cut that out. You're having too much fun. You can't enjoy this. And yet, what a distortion of God. God has a way in our lives of giving us desires that as we pursue them becomes right the center of His will. And it becomes a source of fulfillment. All right. Does everybody get the idea? Now, by the way, which of those are more spiritual? Everybody with me on this one? It's an integrated life. It's not secular and spiritual. It's what God has called you to do at that time. Now, here's my assignment, because if you're in this class, you know we've got to have assignments. All right, here's what I want you to consider doing. I would like for every couple to go through an exercise of establishing goals for 2014. And here's how I want you to do it. I want you to look at the universal word God has given each of you to do, construction, commandment, commission, and ask God's Spirit to impress you with any goals you need to set in this area. It may be, I just need to start getting into a Bible study. I need devotional quiet time. I need to start basically doing X, Y, whatever it is. But ask God to impress you with that. You write it down. Number 2. Oh, and do that for the Great Commandment and for the Great Commission. He may impress you with some spheres of influence people that you haven't talked to in a while. And maybe your life has taken more of a spiritual turn. And they don't know that. And so you dust off your vocabulary and you come up with the theology of come and see. That's the extent of all you can say. But you just say, come and see. And maybe that's a step you need to take. Now, review the unique work God has called you to do. My calling, my needs, my opportunities and desires, and ask God's Spirit to impress you with any goals you need to set in this area. Now, conceivably, you could have a lot of goals, which means, what was our first point in Philippians 3?
One thing.
One thing. All right, so you want to try to narrow this thing down, so you want to make this a matter of discussion and prayer with your husband, wife, interact, talk about it, pray about it, and then select the top 3. I think anybody that tries to have more than 3 significant goals at one time, you're simply dabbling in a lot of different things. The challenge always becomes focus, working on something that you can really get behind. And then here's take an initial face step with each goal by the end of January. Now the reason that's important is if you never take a step, I would probably predict that nothing will happen. And sometimes the step can be as simple as making one phone call. It just might be one phone call. It might be picking up the phone, talking to so-and-so. It might be taking a simple step. But it's an idea of asking God's Spirit to impress you and then being willing to take that simple step. Everybody see that? All right, that's the assignment. So I want to see some goals that you can kind of think through and work through for this year so that we can be experiencing this idea of success and significance as to what God calls us to do. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for your word. Thank you for the opportunity for this new year. And I pray you would guide each of us to consider goals that would bring honor and glory to you this year. In Christ's name, amen.